Hey everyone, welcome back. Ready for another deep dive?
Always ready.
Okay, good. Because this one is pretty big.
Yeah.
Things are moving fast in the Ukraine conflict. And it's starting to look like we might be at a turning point.
I think so, yeah.
It seems like a peace deal might actually be on the table, but not necessarily the kind of outcome a lot of people were expecting.
Right.
And in this deep dive, we're going to look beyond the usual headlines and try to understand why this potential peace might actually be shaped more on Russia's terms.
Absolutely. I think one of the most interesting things is how the narrative is shifting and how we're starting to see maybe a change where the U.S. and maybe the West in general is starting to understand Russia's perspective more, particularly when it comes to their security concerns in the region.
I think you're right about that.
Yeah.
In fact, just last week, we had that prisoner exchange between the U.S. and Russia. Mark Fogel, the American teacher who was imprisoned in Russia for having marijuana, was swapped for Alexander Vinnik, the Russian, who was convicted of cryptocurrency fraud.
Yeah. That's
So-
pretty standard exchange.
At first glance, seems like
Right at first glance.
a pretty standard exchange. But then things took a pretty interesting turn.
Well, yeah, that's the thing. It wasn't just an isolated event.
Right.
The exchange was immediately followed by Trump's special envoy heading over to Moscow.
Okay.
And that paved the way for Trump and Putin to actually talk directly. And boom, a 90-minute phone call where they agree to start negotiating Ukraine's future right away.
Yeah. It did seem to happen really fast.
That was huge.
Like everyone suddenly decided to go to the negotiating table. So that's the what.
Yeah.
But what about the why? Why this sudden push for peace talks after years of fighting?
I mean, one factor we can't ignore is that there's a growing sense, even in the West, even among some top military figures, that just pouring money into the conflict isn't magically going to lead to a Ukrainian victory. The idea that some kind of compromise is the only way forward is gaining traction.
Okay, so that's where Russia's perspective really starts to come into focus.
Yeah,
And it does seem like that perspective hasn't always been given enough weight,
I agree.
especially in Western media.
Exactly.
So how do we even begin to grasp what's happening here?
I think to really understand, we need to go beyond those headlines. We need to think about the long and complex history between Russia and Ukraine. Even though Ukraine became independent after the Soviet Union collapsed, Russia has always considered Ukraine a vital part of its sphere of influence, economically, strategically, you name it.
And 2014 seems like a pivotal year in all of this, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely.
That's when the West-backed change in leadership in Kiev happened.
Yeah.
And Russia really started viewing things as a direct threat to their interests.
Yeah, absolutely. From Moscow's point of view, what went down in 2014, especially the removal of a pro-Russian president, was a massive threat.
Yeah.
A massive threat to their security. And you can't forget that there's a substantial Russian-speaking population in Ukraine, especially in the eastern regions. And Russia felt like it had an obligation to protect their interests.
Right. And then there's the whole issue of NATO expansion, which has been a major sticking point for Russia all along.
For sure.
They see NATO moving eastward as basically encroaching on their territory and posing a direct threat to their national security.
It's a core issue. They've repeatedly expressed serious concerns about NATO expanding, claiming it's a broken promise from the West. Their argument is that having NATO in Eastern Europe, particularly in places like Poland and the Baltic states, undermines their security and makes conflict way more likely.
And it's not just Russia who's saying this. Even U.S. Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth has stated that expecting Ukraine to go back to its 2014 borders is
unrealistic.
Yeah. That's a pretty significant admission, wouldn't you say?
Definitely. I think it suggests that Washington's stance is shifting. And by acknowledging that it's unlikely Ukraine will regain control of Donbass and Crimea, the U.S. is implicitly accepting that Russia has control over those territories. And that, in turn, opens the door for a peace agreement that acknowledges the situation as it stands right now, on the ground as it is.
I see.
Yeah.
Okay, so it really does seem like a peace deal. Even if it isn't exactly what everyone had in mind, is becoming a real possibility.
I think so.
But what happens next?
Yeah, that's what
would this shift mean for the bigger picture, for the whole global landscape?
That's where things get really interesting.
Okay.
Because if this peace agreement actually does go through, it could totally reshape the balance of power.
Wow.
On a global scale,
right?
First and foremost.
Yeah.
It would be a major win for Russia.
Right.
Proving that they can achieve their strategic goals using military force and diplomacy.
And wouldn't that send a pretty powerful message to other countries?
Absolutely.
Especially those thinking about challenging the way things are in the world right now.
For sure. I mean, it would reinforce the idea that military force is still a viable option for achieving geopolitical objectives, and that the West, even with all its economic and military muscle, can't always step in effectively to prevent it.
So potentially, we could be looking at a much more assertive Russia on the world stage.
Possibly.
Maybe even emboldened by what happens in Ukraine. But what about the West, especially the United States? How would this peace deal impact their position and influence?
Well, it would likely trigger some serious soul-searching in Washington. People are going to start questioning whether their strategy in Ukraine was effective, especially that heavy reliance on economic sanctions and military aid. You'll have some arguing that the U.S. should have intervened more directly, while others will say this is a necessary step back from a situation that could have escalated dangerously.
And it makes you wonder about the future of NATO, too.
Yeah.
If Ukraine, a country that was actively trying to join, ends up making significant concessions to Russia, what does that say about NATO's ability to protect its partners?
That's a crucial point. The outcome of this conflict could send shockwaves throughout Eastern Europe. Countries like Poland and the Baltic states, which have depended heavily on NATO security guarantees, might start having doubts about whether the alliance is really committed to their defense, whether it can truly be relied upon.
So basically, we could be witnessing a reshuffling of alliances and partnerships as countries reevaluate their security arrangements in light of this new reality. It's almost like we're watching the geopolitical map being redrawn in real time.
You could say that the old assumptions and certainties that have governed international relations for decades are being challenged. We're moving into a period of much greater uncertainty, where the balance of power is shifting and the rules of the game are being rewritten.
Wow. So we've talked about this potential peace deal and all the forces driving it and what it could mean for the world. It's a lot to digest.
Definitely.
I have to admit, it's making me look at things a bit differently. What about you?
Yeah, it's complex. A lot of potential consequences. But even with all the uncertainty, there's a chance this could be a good thing. You know, if this change in approach actually brings lasting peace to Ukraine, it could set the stage for a more stable world, even if it's a different one than we're used to.
I see what you mean. Even if this peace deal isn't exactly what everyone imagined it could be, a first step towards a more realistic and less confrontational way of handling international relations. Maybe less focus on ideology and more on finding common ground.
Exactly. This could be our chance to move away from that winner-takes-all mentality that's dominated global politics for so long. It's about recognizing that everyone involved has legitimate interests.
So instead of constantly trying to outmaneuver each other, countries could start working together on the things that affect us all.
Precisely.
Like climate change, pandemics, economic instability.
Those are the big ones, And by acknowledging Russia's security concerns and including them in the conversation, instead of constantly pushing them away, the West could actually help create a more stable and predictable security environment in Europe.
It's a new way of thinking.
Yeah.
But I can see how it could lead to a more peaceful and prosperous future.
Yeah.
For everyone.
Of course, there are no guarantees.
Right.
There will always be challenges and disagreements.
Sure.
But by shifting the focus from confrontation to cooperation, we might be able to create a world where diplomacy and dialogue are more important than military strength.
So maybe this potential peace deal in Ukraine is about more than just ending a conflict.
Yeah, I think so.
It could be about redefining the entire international system and building a new era of global cooperation.
It's a big hope.
It is a lot to hope for.
Yeah.
But hey, maybe we're on the verge of something truly transformative.
Only time will tell, but it's definitely worth considering.
Okay.
The important thing now is to stay open to new ideas and approaches, to keep talking to each other constructively, and to look for solutions that benefit everyone.
Well said. And on that note, I think it's time to wrap up this deep dive. It's been a fascinating conversation, and I'm honestly leaving with a sense of cautious optimism.
Yeah.
Maybe we are witnessing the birth of a new and better world order. What do you think?
We'll see.
Is a lasting peace in Ukraine possible? And what kind of world will emerge from this conflict? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. Subscribe to our podcast, available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. We are here to make things clear.